But welcome, and thank you so much for being here for this exciting opportunity and talk. For those who don't know, I'm Kimberly Moffitt, and I'm serving as the Dean for the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. And actually, the Lipitz Award is an honor that we bestow each year to a professor. So really excited to present this year's colleague. I have the distinct honor, we all do have the distinct honor of hearing our colleague, Dr. Christine Mallinson, today, who is this year's Lipitz Award winner. Roger C. Lipitz and the Lipitz Family Foundation have established this endowed fund in the college for the purpose of which, quote, shall be to provide funds to recognize and support innovative and distinguished teaching and or research in the arts, humanities, and social sciences here at UMBC by honoring one of our very own professors. This year's awardee, Dr. Mallinson, is Professor of Language, Literacy, and Culture, Ph.D. program, just a shout out because that's my home department, Director of the Center for Social Science Scholarship, and Affiliate Professor of Gender and Women and Sexuality Studies. She also serves as Special Assistant in the Office of Research and Creative Achievement and is an APLU Council on Research Leader Fellow. Dr. Mallinson's interdisciplinary and collaborative research comprehensively examines language as a socially and culturally contextualized practice in order to address linguistic bias and misinformation and expand educational equity. Reflecting her longstanding commitment to carrying out engaged academic work within a social justice framework, she aims to apply research to dismantle deficient notions surrounding cultural and linguistic difference in ways that are community-centered and while informing social and educational policy and practice. She is the co-author and co-editor of 7 books and numerous other publications. Dr. Mallinson currently co-leads 2 National Science Foundation Awards, working with scholars and students across linguistics and language sciences, education, and data science. She is also a current member and past chair of the Ethics Committee of the Linguistic Society of America, as well as a member of several journal and university advisory boards. Her most recent edited collections with Oxford University Press, entitled Inclusion in Linguistics and Decolonizing Linguistics, were published this year and a part of a panel discussion at Swarthmore just earlier this week. Today, we have the opportunity to hear her talk to us about what does language do and what can we do with it. She captures that particular statement by raising the point for us that language is essential to humanity. How we use language is a key part of how we define ourselves and how we relate to each other as individuals and in society. In recent years, however, and this is a key point, the authenticity of how we communicate has been disrupted tremendously by the rise of AI-generated content, including images, video, text, and audio, which can be used as powerful vehicles for deception. In this talk, centering the case of audio deepfakes, Mallinson explores why language matters, what it does, how it works, and what we can do with knowledge about how humans use it. Through interdisciplinary collaboration, she asserts that researchers can more fully address pressing challenges of our time, from misinformation and disinformation to developing ethical and responsible language technologies to sustaining global linguistic diversity while advancing equity and inclusion in the humanistic and scientific study of language itself. I am not the lady of the hour, so I want to step aside so that we do have the opportunity to hear who we are here for, who has an important message to share with us about language. So if we can please welcome Dr. Christine Mallinson.
Thank you, Dean Moffitt. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yep.
Thank you all so much for being here. What an amazing turnout. I'm so grateful. It's such an honor to give a talk to colleagues and friends, so thank you all so much. I want to give another thank you to the Lipitz Family Foundation that supported my work this year, the Lipitz Professorship Selection Committee, the Cos Dean's Office, the National Science Foundation, and all the many wonderful colleagues and students, many of whom are here today, who have participated in the research that I'll be talking about. You all will get lots of shout outs throughout the talk, so stay tuned. And last but not least, I could not do anything without my colleagues in the Center for Social Science Scholarship, especially Amy Barnes, who organized everything for today's lecture and reception. Is just an amazing colleague. Thank you, Amy. So once again, thank you all for being here. Yes, big round of applause for Amy. Thank you all so much. Okay, let's get started. Okay, so I want to start by asking you to engage what I'm going to call your mind's ear and imagine the sound of a loved one's voice. Maybe a child, spouse, parent, or sibling, best friend. Chances are you can bring to mind how they sound. And chances are recalling their voice is meaningful to you. Maybe you're smiling or feeling nostalgic right now as you think about the person whose voice you remember. Human voices are incredible, and so is human language. I'll be focusing today on spoken language, and I will also mostly be focusing on English in this talk, but I want to make clear that this point about the beauty of language stands for all languages across its many modalities, signed, spoken, written, in all of its diversity, creativity, and innovation. As you just experienced when you imagined the voice of your loved one, we can often call to mind how someone sounds. This is because each person has a vocal fingerprint, so to speak, that is part of our identity. And as a result, the way we talk, consciously or unconsciously, reveals something about who we are and where we come from. I can still hear in my mind the voices and the accents of my grandparents, for example, who were immigrants from Germany and who inspired much of my love for language. For myself, I grew up in North Carolina, and you might be able to hear a bit of a Southern accent that still lingers. Humans also use language to engage in meaning making, and so we might choose to emphasize more consciously certain features of how we use language as a way of indicating our participation in a cultural group or showing loyalty to a place as a means of signaling that we are insiders who belong. This is how language markers can become cultural markers on a broader scale. I snapped this picture a couple of years ago in a shop window down in Fells Point. In this house, we hang out on stoops, drop the T in Baltimore, meaning Baltimore, shake Old Bay on everything, shout, oh, in the anthem, as many of you have experienced when you attend an Orioles game. This poster is a fun example of those connections between language, identity, and cultural belonging through a Baltimore lens. But as most of us who have spent some time in the city, in and around the city, also know, not everyone who's a Baltimorean pronounces O the same way, or other aspects of language for that matter. The same point applies to Hun. This is a picture I took in the Whole Foods down in Harbor East a few years ago. Hun is another example of language that's been singled out in the media as being distinctive of Baltimore. But many folks have pointed out this is a word that's used by a generally white female working class swath of the population and a particular subculture of the city. Every city is more than what gets popularized in the media, of course, but this is a trend. Here in Baltimore, there's traditionally been the most attention to or emphasis on the accents of white folks in the city. This variety has even been called Balmorese, or the Baltimore accent. But of course, this is an overgeneralization. We might even call it linguistic whitewashing. As my students learn right away on day one in my classes, there are many accents and many varieties of any language, including English and including English in Baltimore. To put it simply, there isn't just one Baltimore accent, there are many and varied. I recently read this funny memoir by the author R. Eric Thomas, who's a Baltimore native. I love this quote because it really exemplifies how most of us perceive other people's speech. And I'll be honest, it's basically a master class in just one quote in what the field of sociolinguistic studies, which is the area that I come from. Here's the quote on the screen. I just want to break down a couple pieces. First, in the middle here, the Baltimore accent, we can see Thomas pointing to specific pronunciations such as wooder that characterize accents in Baltimore. We also see his recognition that there isn't just one type of language in Baltimore. He comments on his view of differences between white and black accents in the city. At the same time, we see that people aren't generally very precise in how they identify linguistic differences or the terms that they have for talking about them. For example, he mentions marble mouth, not a linguistic term, and musical, and higher in the face, also not a precise descriptor, and not linguistically accurate. My grandparents were from Germany and came from different regions, and each of them said that family members in the other region spoke like they had potatoes in their mouth. Potatoes, marbles, we're often looking for ways to describe what we hear. These are some of what linguists call folk descriptions of language, or folk linguistics. Sometimes they're not so accurate, but sometimes they are. As this quote demonstrates, people do have an ability to pick up on some nuances of language variation, even if there comes a point at which most folks can't quite put a finger on what they're hearing and don't quite have the terminology to name it. More on that point later. The last thing that I want to point out are the bits at the beginning and at the end of the quote. I certainly didn't have a Baltimore accent, and I don't have an accent no matter what you hear. In this case, we know the author is clearly joking, but in more extreme iterations, this belief that accents and dialects are something that other people have, but not ourselves, is common and problematic. It can lead to the idea that some folks hold that accents are a problem, or that language of a different type than ours is other or wrong or deficient or broken, and by extension, the groups of people who use those languages and varieties. As we know from both linguistics and from allied fields such as sociology, psychology, and so on, humans often hold biases that are explicit and conscious, as well as implicit and unconscious. Linguistic biases can be both explicit and implicit. So when people who grow up in the US tell immigrants to speak English or go home, that's an example of explicit linguistic bias. When people comment to a person of color, "Oh, wow, you're so articulate," that's an example of implicit linguistic bias. So we see the attitudes about language aren't only about language, they are also about other social dimensions such as race, ethnicity, gender, and so on. And people's attitudes and beliefs about how other people talk can affect how we treat them. This means that language is a double-edged sword. It is an important mechanism for identity and belonging, as we talked about at the beginning of the talk, and it can also be a powerful mechanism for exclusion and gatekeeping. For this reason, the field of sociolinguistics that I affiliate myself with is pretty dedicated to doing the work of combating negative language ideologies by celebrating accents and dialects and varieties, by calling out linguistic bias and discrimination, and by advocating and training for linguistic equity and inclusion, especially when it comes to social and educational opportunities. This call to action for justice and inclusion is what personally motivates me to do the work that I do as a scholar. Some of my most formative life experiences, such as being the granddaughter of immigrants to this country who had very strong accents, and as someone who grew up in the US South, where there are a lot of politics around how people talk, and where there's also a lot of pride, but also a lot of linguistic bias and stigma, shapes my own intentionality for doing this work, and at the heart of it, to make sure that everyone hears the message that linguistic diversity and equity is human diversity and equity. Some of you all might recognize my colleague, Ann Charity Headley, who is hopefully going to be here today and wasn't able to make it, but I promised I'd send her the recording. Perhaps nowhere more important for that message to be heard is in schools. Over the years, I've done a lot of work to promote linguistic awareness and inclusion in education with my colleague Ann. Since I'm focusing today's talk on work that I've mainly done in the past year as the Lipitz professor, I'll just mention our most recent work with the American Federation of Teachers, where we have done talks, webinars. We also wrote 2 pieces in the American Educator, which is not only open access, but has a print run of over 1 million. The magazine goes out to all million AFT members in the country. I've also done, in years past and this year, worked with hundreds of lawyers and judges to address the very real problem of explicit and implicit bias in the courtroom and in our legal system. This year I presented with former LLC doctoral student, who some of you may recognize, Troy Grant, on a panel about linguistic equity and inclusion for the Maryland Pro Bono Resource Center. Lots of my other students have been involved in linguistic awareness and public educational facing work over the years, such as these wonderful podcast episodes that some of my students did a couple years ago. They even created a short film about linguistic diversity on our campus at UMBC. All of these products are still available online at baltimorelanguage.com. Again, they're from a few years ago, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention it because their work has been so foundational to my overall goals of celebrating the many accents and varieties that are found in and around Baltimore. My students and I also edited the Wikipedia page for Baltimore accent, which was woefully underdeveloped until we got a hold of it. We researched and contributed the content that you see here about the wide landscape of Baltimore's linguistic diversity. That project was supported by the WikiEDU Foundation and with internal funding from UMBC. So just to summarize a bit, we've seen that sociolinguists study all aspects of the social use of language. Linguistics itself is a wonderfully diverse and border-crossing discipline. We use all sorts of humanistic and scientific methods, statistical analyses, experimental methods, acoustic analysis, surveys, interviews, and more. We analyze the production of language, which is how people use language individually and collectively, from those vowel sounds like the O's and the waters to vocabulary and grammar, even gesture, and so on. And relatedly, we study the distribution of those patterns, which reveals how social differences are encoded within language. So for example, whether you say soda or pop, or whether you say coffee or coffee, as I grew up saying, as well as patterns of grammar, sound patterns, and more. These differences can be tracked, mapped, and analyzed for everything from families and neighborhoods and individuals to gender, racial, and ethnic categories to patterns within and across languages and even around the world, such as linguistic flows related to globalization. We also study people's perceptions and ideologies about language. When it comes to what we perceive, experimental research shows that as humans, we're actually pretty good at identifying some of the nuances of who's who based on how they talk. Even if, as we saw earlier, we might not have the precise technical understanding or linguistic terminology to effectively pinpoint it or explain it. The ideologies part is the study of what people believe about what they perceive. This includes those more damaging versions like linguistic bias, linguistic racism, and linguistic discrimination, as well as the positive aspects like linguistic pride, along with more subtle ideas that people hold about their own and other people's language use. Because language is so tied to who we are, and because many people have strong beliefs about how our own or other people's language should sound, we tend to place a high premium on sounding authentic. Y'all remember about 20 years when Madonna married Guy Ritchie, moved to the UK, and suddenly had a British accent? I think it's safe to say she was pretty roundly ridiculed by folks in the US as well as folks in the UK. Why did you let me do that to myself? She said, I'm from Michigan. We tend not to like it when people don't sound like themselves. And we don't like it when people sound what we think of as fake. So put differently, we really value it when people sound authentic. In 2023, in fact, America's oldest dictionary, Merriam-Webster, declared authentic to be the word of the year. According to an article in Smithsonian Magazine, this is because Merriam-Webster said it saw a substantial increase in online searches for the word this year, with interest being driven in large part by stories and conversations about AI. According to the dictionary editors, all these searches are an indicator that in the current AI era, the ability to differentiate between what is real and unreal is increasingly difficult. Today, false images masquerade as celebrities, robocalls impersonate political candidates, and readily available apps can impersonate anyone's voice or manipulate it in seconds, in authorized and in unauthorized ways. What has especially undermined and disrupted the trustworthiness of how humans communicate are deepfakes, images, videos, text, and audio content that has been synthetically generated or manipulated using AI methods. These are often hyper-realistic manipulations, and they've been used as powerful vehicles for deception, fraud, threat, misinformation, disinformation, and social turmoil. It's so bad that the World Economic Forum recently released its Global Risks Report of 2024, which ranks AI-generated misinformation and disinformation as the second biggest short-term risk to society, right under extreme weather. This is particularly bad because, as research has found, false information often spreads faster, especially on social media, as our media colleagues know. It spreads faster than accurate information. Because we know there's so much false information out there, it's changing what we believe. We know we have to be skeptical, but that means we might even question things that are actually real. My almost 12-year-old daughter recently saw a picture of me from my own childhood, and she asked if I had used one of those old-timey filters. That's a lighthearted example, but it's also a great indication of the mindset that kids are coming into the world with today. What of the media around me, the text, the images, the sounds, are real, and what's fake? Back when I was growing up, and probably when you all were too, if you saw a video or a photo, you could probably safely take it as more or less a truthful representation of what happened, and that's no longer the case. Our present moment challenges our humanity. If we can't tell who's who, and we can't believe what we hear or what other people say, then what is truth and what is real? This is for the historians in the room. It gets even trickier when the tools we have at our disposal for checking don't work or aren't reliable. In a recent example, as this article reports, when the text of the US Constitution was fed into a detector tool, it was flagged as having almost certainly been written by AI. Now, these false positives are alarming, and not only to the historians, although I do like that image of ChatGPT with James Madison. There's a linguistic reason why these false positives get triggered for writing such as the kind that appears in the US Constitution. Actual human writing is more dynamic and variable. For example, we might write a long, complex sentence followed by a short, simple one, or we might use complex vocabulary mixed with shorter vocabulary. This type of variation is normal and natural in human-generated speech. But AI-generated text tends to be more uniform, which is why something that's more structured and formal writing, like the Constitution, might flag as AI-generated fake text. Leaders globally know that this is a big problem. Not only text, not only video, not only images, it also applies to sound and speech. This past October, Biden signed an executive order on safe, secure, and trustworthy AI. Deepfakes use AI-generated audio and video to smear reputations, spread fake news, and commit fraud, he said. I've watched one of me, and I said, when the hell did I say that? 3 months later, in late January, as you all probably saw, robocalls were going around in New Hampshire impersonating Biden's voice and telling folks not to vote in the primary. An analysis after the fact suggested that the text-to-speech tool that was used in this case was from the company 11 Labs, which last year had released a free AI text-to-speech tool that can copy or manipulate a person's own voice and produce authentic-sounding video in just seconds. The tool clearly says you're only supposed to use it to play around with your own voice. But of course, this did not happen. Right after that, in February, the FCC voted to ban scam robocalls that use AI-generated voices, which is a great first step, but this only addresses robocalls, which are a small slice of the pie, and there's a lack of regulations on other digitally altered content, including its use in political campaigns. Furthermore, banning something can help, but it doesn't necessarily prevent it. The FTC prohibited most robocalls to consumers back in 2009, but of course we all still routinely receive them. For deepfakes in particular, it's even more concerning when we take into account how quickly people can post things online. Unlike making individual scam phone calls, how social media enables the viral spread of massive amounts of fake content is concerning. We can sum it up by saying, creating fake content is easier than ever. Detecting it is increasingly difficult, and so far at least, legislation is a step behind. Last month, Vandana Janeja and I wrote an op-ed for Maryland Matters about this problem. The photo that accompanies our op-ed is of President Richard Nixon meeting with Secretary of State Henry Kissinger in the Oval Office. As you all likely know, in the early 1970s, the American public learned of audio recordings that revealed Richard Nixon's prior knowledge of criminal activity and participation in its cover-up. What became known as the Watergate scandal caused an ensuing political earthquake. But in today's AI era, the authors write, we're increasing, meaning us, the authors, we're increasingly confronting the possibility that the media we encounter may not be genuine. So to solve this problem, Vonda and I make the point that there's a real role for us to play as researchers, as you'll see in the headline, by bringing people and technology together to tackle this challenge head on. That is, to put it otherwise, not just using AI to detect AI, okay? This is what we've been working on for almost 2 years now, and I want to double back a bit and tell you how we got into this work and what we have found so far. Vonda and I started working on this topic back in fall of 2021 when she emailed me to say that she had recently done a study with a student on deepfake detection and was looking for a partner to take this project forward, ideally someone who knew something about how English works. I said, I think that might be me. When we met, we reflected on a situation that had just happened in September 2021, in which the company Aussie Media tried to drive a fraudulent $40 million investment deal from Goldman Sachs. In a near-final phone call, one of the voices, quote, began to sound strange to the Goldman Sachs team, as reported in the New York Times, as though it might have been digitally altered. The situation turned out to be an attempt to impersonate a key executive to close the deal, and it was thwarted only by a listener's keen ear. Aussie Media folded after the incident. Its founder and CEO and 2 other top executives were arrested and indicted on federal fraud charges. This story led us to think, what was it that triggered that person's keen ear? To think that the voice on the other end of the line sounded strange. I figured, that linguistics ought to have something that it can say about this. We should have some insights, ideally some tools. We submitted a proposal to the National Science Foundation's EAGER program, which funds high-risk, high-reward research, and we got it, and we started our work in June of 2022. I'm not going to have too many slides with charts and figures on it, but the fun part, but also the challenging part of this work is that it was brand new, and so we had to figure out where to begin. In brief, our data science team members, especially our student Sarah Kanjani, created a data set that now has nearly 1,000 samples, if not more, of real and fake audio clips, with the fake clips representing several different generations, and these were pulled from largely existing data sets. On the sociolinguistic side, joined by my students LaVon Davis and undergrad at the time, Chloe Everett, we annotated the clips for a defined set of 5 commonly occurring, variable, and easily discernible features of spoken language and spoken English. These were pitch, the melody of speech, pause, the regular pauses that we take, word initial and word final consonant stops, so like stop, or cat, or kick. Do you hear those bursts? Audible intake or outtake of breath, and overall audio quality. We know that machine-generated speech often has trouble producing the melody of speech, which we're capturing here by focusing on pitch. We also hypothesized that AI would not be as good as producing variation in speech the way that humans do, like those bursts of air, or the ohs and the wooters that we've talked about already today. Things like consonant bursts are just some of the characteristics that make human speech distinct and distinguishing. And they're exactly what we study in sociolinguistics, especially variation in sociolinguistics, which is the generally quantitative subfield of dialect study that I was trained in as a graduate student. So I'm not going to go, again, too much into our methods, but if anybody's interested, please ask me. I'd love to share some of our papers. But in brief, wherever we found the production of these features within the data set, we annotated them and marked whether they occurred either in expected ways or anomalous ways. So for example, pitch that was unusually fluctuating or flat, or a lack of pause where one would be expected, or the insertion of a pause where one wouldn't be expected, such as in the middle of a phrase, okay? For the consonants, a lack of burst of air where it would be expected and vice versa, audible intake or outtake of breath, and overall quality. That was an estimation for sound that's sort of tinny, robotic, distorted, that you might recognize from some computer-generated speech. This process gave us a whole bunch of expert annotated data. This is important because detection efforts for AI, or for AI-generated speech, usually rely on just improving algorithms to catch the next best fake, leading to a vicious cycle where adversaries simply improve the deepfakes and so on. These current methods rely on traditional features and are frequently disrupted by their same technology. So we need to figure out how can we bring in new features that might be identified by and informed by human expertise. Oops, sorry. Again, I won't go too much in depth, but one of our main findings is that when we incorporated those features into machine learning classifiers, it has substantially improved fake audio detection models. This graph shows several models. Our baseline model is that brown hexagonal line there at the bottom. That's the one fed by traditional acoustics. It's one of the well-performing baselines in the competition for deepfake and logical access tasks. Its accuracy is 0.61. It turns out to be the lowest performing model, however. For all the other models, we fed our features into them and they improved significantly, going up to 0.884 accuracy for the logistic regression, which is the blue star line at the top. This is just one graph, and there's lots more findings and lots more detail, but the important piece is that we found improvement with our method even with a small data set, which is a benefit because most methods for detection require large data sets for traditional AI-based detectors. We've published and presented our work in various outlets, including IEEE ISI and AAAI for the data science folks in the room, as well as at the Linguistic Society of America and AAAL for the linguists in the room. We have a couple other papers submitted to data science and linguistic outlets. Vonda and I also gave a talk recently, as you'll see in the upper right quadrant, to a women in technology group in Brunei. I like to say I've been to Brunei, but it was just virtual. I wish I could have gone in person. Led by Carolyn Seaman and sponsored by the State Department. That was such a fun experience. There was an article about this in UMBC News, and then our two NSF RAU students, Kiffy Nwosu and Chloe Everett, did a podcast episode on their collaborative work as students on this project for the CS3 podcast, Retrieving the Social Sciences. So we are all spreading the word about results of our work. Now, those positive results are helping answer just one of our research questions, which was whether incorporating linguistically annotated data could improve AI algorithms for audio deepfake detection. That was one of our research questions. But that work has the limitation of still being a largely AI-based method for detecting AI. That's often a problem where the data sets being used aren't exactly what we might hear in real life and where it's AI technology trying to catch AI technology. A recent NPR story pointed this out, noting that machine learning models are usually better at detecting fake audio than people are, but they can still easily be stumped in the wild, as they put it, especially if the audio is poor or if there's background noise. This is something that our team also wanted to tackle, but from a slightly different angle, and it brings us to our second research question, which goes back to that Goldman Sachs Aussie media situation that I presented earlier, with the person on the other end of the call thinking, something doesn't quite sound right here, which is, what should real people do if we encounter fake audio or audio that you don't know if it's real or fake in real time? And can linguistics, with our insights into perception, do anything to help? This is a real concern because many studies, this is not our study, but it's a great one, many studies have shown that in general, for all types of fake content, video, images, text, audio, we are not great at detecting. Basically, we're successful at about the rate of chance. And even worse, we think we're better than we actually are. Overconfidence, or what we call the Dunning-Kruger effect in social science, is a very common and problematic bias in human decision-making. We tend to think we perform better than we do. Moreover, people who perform the worst tend to be the most overconfident. Let's put that together. I know, let that sink in for a minute. Let that sink in. Let's put that together with research from studies of misinformation that has found that we tend to skew towards believing that content is authentic rather than false. And moreover, we're often bad at discerning fake content because we're just not paying attention. So to sum up, as humans, number one, we're generally inattentive. Two, we're not primed to think about audio. Number three, we tend to believe what we see and hear anyway. And number four, we're overconfident in our abilities. This is not good. we wanted to see if we could make a dent in those trends. To do so, we've been studying whether we can teach students to tune in to features of speech in ways that might help them more accurately differentiate real audio from fake audio. Remember that I mentioned earlier that sociolinguists tend to take very seriously the idea of education about language through workshops and trainings. That disciplinary tradition has shaped this work too. From this work, we know that linguistic bias can be mitigated through education. There's a long history of sociolinguistic work on that. And we know that people's perceptual acuity can be honed with linguistic training. So we wanted to figure out, can we apply those methods or similar ones to create sociolinguistically informed trainings that can improve listeners' audio deepfake discernment? Not detection, right, but discernment, how we can discern with our ears. Control groups received a reading about deepfakes, while experimental groups received a short training by my wonderful GA, Levon Davis. Here's a picture of Levon, presenting to students. We did some pilot trainings in 2022, and then in fall 2023, Levon led trainings for over 250 students at UMBC. I want to give a huge shout out to Levon, and a huge thank you to Dr. Anton Tomlin and Mark Brzezinski, who were the instructors in English and computing, who kindly let us into their classes multiple times to carry out these experiments. We could not have done this without them. Indeed. Now, these trainings were short because nobody can spare long periods of time to take a training about deepfakes. These were about 15 to 20 minutes. First, Levon talked to students about audio deepfakes, and then he went through each of those 5 linguistic features that I mentioned before: pitch, pause, consonant bursts, intake and outtake of breath, audio quality, and talked to the students about what to listen for, whether you're hearing them as you would expect them to be produced or whether you're hearing any anomalies. And these may be not telltale necessarily, but indicators of potentially authentic versus fake speech. We gave them a pre-test and a post-test 3 weeks before and 3 weeks after the trainings, with the trainings in between, so the span of 9 weeks, where they listened to 20 audio clips and indicated whether they thought the clips were real, fake, or if they were unsure. We're still doing a little more work on this, but we've had some really interesting findings so far. First, for the experimental group overall, we saw a significant decrease in the percentage of responses in which students responded with an unsure answer, by about 2.5% for each student. And so that's good. We're helping them be more confident. As a side note, I really want to thank our undergrad student who I saw come in here somewhere, Nehal Nakvi, and his mentor, Liz Stanwyck, for helping us carry out many, many rounds of statistical analysis that are giving us these findings. I'm not including, I think Nehal ended up with something like 40 charts. I'm not including these here, but if you'd like to see them, just let me know. So a few additional findings related to this point. Okay, so we decreased their uncertainty. Of the 353 questions that were marked as unsure in the pre-survey, 85% of those that represented a fake clip were then correctly identified by the students as fake in the post-survey. This is great. So we were able to improve their uncertainty in the right direction towards greater accuracy when it comes to fake clips. On the other hand, though, only about 20% of the clips that students were unsure about that were real were then correctly identified as real in the post-survey. Now, this doesn't really surprise me. If they weren't sure about real clips to begin with, they may have still had those questions after taking our training, which largely focused on characteristics of real speech. So we have some more work that we want to do. Maybe they were just unsure for different reasons. We're going to keep looking into this. Oh, I'm sorry. I meant to click. There we go. Okay. So now for an unexpected finding. Students who were in the control group who did not receive the training, but instead received a short reading about audio deepfakes, also showed improvement. This is a surprise because in many studies that are out there, training has a negligible effect in terms of training that just focuses on awareness, okay? But nevertheless, this is a good finding. In fact, from the pre-test to the post-test, students were significantly more accurate by almost 10% in their ability to identify short clips of less than 2 seconds. That is very tough to do. A less than 2 second clip to have improvement on identifying it as real or fake. In contrast, the students who did take the training were better at longer clips. Again, we're still trying to figure out what all that means, but maybe without the training, student went with their gut I'm not sure, and maybe it was still useful. Maybe the training helped the students in the experimental group worry too much about the clips that they were given and trying to figure out what features they're listening for, and maybe for them the longer clips were useful. Regardless, though, our overall findings do suggest that these trainings are promising and that there's a need for investing in human discernment techniques, and also that it's possible to improve how we listen, especially if we take a comprehensive approach with multi-pronged approaches like readings and trainings for listening. We might be able to make some headway. Trainings are some tools that we can then add to our toolbox, and they will hopefully give us more pathways for intervention than just AI-based detection methods of AI. And I think there's a lot of room here for other social science disciplines to contribute to this effort: psychology, sociology, communication studies, and so on. Speaking of interdisciplinarity, this past February, we extended beyond our usual disciplinary approaches to spread the word about audio deepfakes when we partnered with the CADVC to do a faculty research exhibit. Many thanks to Rebecca Uchel and her team for the invitation and for helping us make the gallery exhibit a reality. All of these beautiful color-coded panels that you see here, those are actual printed sound waves of real and fake speech, some real, some fake. This is why I haven't played any samples for you of fake audio or real audio today, because we were able to keep these beautiful panels, and we've brought them with us here today. They're over in the corner for you all to experience. So after the talk, just find a panel, scan the QR code, and listen to the sound clip. You'll be able to make your best guess about whether you think it's real or fake, and then you can scroll down to see if your guess is correct. When you click through, you'll also see not only the answer of whether the speech is real or fake, you'll also see some of the linguistic detail that we analyzed as part of the project. These images of waveforms for real and fake speech were selected and analyzed by our students, Chloe Everett and Kifi Nwosu. The green boxes draw your attention to the linguistic features that we focused on in this study. Some of them are features of real speech, and some of them are markers of sound disturbances or anomalies. I'm not going to tell you what's what. You can listen for those yourself. Now, I do not want to give you the impression that linguistics is a magic bullet, however, as much as we might love that. In fact, some of you might be wondering, does analyzing speech for realistic nuances provide a pathway for adversaries to generate even more realistic speech? We've gotten that question at every single conference paper that we have given about our work. The short answer is maybe, but I think we have to try anyway. The longer answer is that is certainly a potential challenge. For example, I recently learned of some new efforts by a sociolinguist with a startup who is adding accent details and conversational features like ums and uhs to fake speech to make it sound more authentic. I was like, really? In other words, what does it mean when fake speech sounds just as authentic speech? Especially because, to go back to my beginning lecture point, as humans, we really like it when people sound authentic. And it turns out we also trust voices that sound like voices that we might be familiar with and comfortable with. This is an issue that raises all sorts of questions, as you see here, about how much we trust non-human beings. It also raises questions about language, such as who decides what is an authentic accent versus what is stereotyping or caricature. Now, it might not be all completely bad or disastrous, but the point is, these are some reasons why I think linguists need to be in the room, to help sort out these potential concerns, to provide ethical guidance, to ensure that some linguistic guardrails are in place. One of those places where linguists need to have a role is to help address equity when it comes to AI and language technology. There is a lot that has been written on this point, so I won't dwell too much on it. But basically, the data sets that are going into AI models, like the large language models, are overwhelmingly trained on English and a certain kind of English, or other high-resource languages. That's the term that's used. Going back to the beginning of my talk, where we affirmed that language is a key part of culture and identity, you can see how an overemphasis on just one language and one type of that language being fed into models that are then often assumed to be generalizable can have inherent problems and biases, cultural nuance, accents, and so on. access issues, bias issues, and so on. When technology is too narrowly designed and implemented, it can also perpetuate linguistic marginalization. In January of this year, Lily Gladstone made history by becoming the first Indigenous performer to win a Golden Globe for Best Actress. Gladstone, who uses she/they pronouns, went on to accept their award in the Blackfoot language. But as this post calls out, when Gladstone gave their remarks, the closed captioning just read, "a global language." It didn't say or identify the language being used as Blackfoot. This is yet another data point in an extremely long history of the erasure of native languages in this country. There was a positive result, though. In the 24 hours after Gladstone's acceptance speech, searches for what is Blackfeet language, and related terms increased by over 3,000%. As this article in Looper notes, Gladstone's win proved the power that Hollywood has to raise awareness and representation. Linguists Alex Darcy and Emily Bender make a similar point in their recent paper on ethics and linguistics. As they write, we have to, quote, unlearn the habit of treating things such as English and mainstream American English, whiteness, speaking, and Euro-American viewpoints as unmarked defaults. This is really important for AI, to go back to our point about not just feeding models with English or even certain kinds of English. When we break out of this habit, Darcy and Bender go on to say, we will open up broader areas of collaboration and study, and be less likely to create models that work only for certain kinds of language use or that marginalize and exclude. Now, I don't want to leave you with the impression that this is something that linguists do naturally, or that we have even had a good history with, or that we have always done. In fact, this is the opposite. This is something that the discipline of linguistics has struggled with historically and is continuing to grapple with. One major critique is that linguistics is what we might call a persistently white discipline. Part of the reason is that there's been what these authors in this wonderful new paper by Haugen et al. Call an extraordinarily strong and relatively stable hierarchy, or what we might even call an oligarchy in the field. This is the analysis that Haugen et al. Produce in this brand new paper. They use social network and heat map visualizations to demonstrate the hierarchy of Ph.D. programs whose graduates dominate the academic job market in linguistics. This figure shows that most faculty in linguistics are both trained at and then are hired into the same 10 to 15 Ph.D. programs. These happen to also be at mainly elite, predominantly white institutions. So you know how we're using AI to catch AI? This is kind of the same thing, but with hiring, training your PhD students and then hiring them. A secondary finding of theirs, which is also incredibly important, is that many of the top programs are also characterized by gender imbalances. So though research such as through research such as this paper, we see that linguistics is in fact what we might call a persistently white, elite, and male-oriented discipline, due in large part to this extraordinarily strong and relatively stable hierarchy. This isolation has had serious repercussions for the discipline of linguistics in terms of equity. In 2018, the Linguistic Society of America reported the population of ethnic minorities with advanced degrees in linguistics is so low in the US that few federal agencies even report the data. That's really bad. That means it's like less than a few percent, okay? Ann Charity Headley, myself, and Mary Buchholz wrote about these issues in a paper we published in 2020 in the top journal Language, where we grappled with the history of the discipline and how it has shaped exclusionary trends in terms of who's studying what languages and language varieties, who is seen as a scholar, who is seen as a prestigious scholar, who is seen as producing good science. Things are getting a bit better, but even today, there are still disproportionately low numbers of scholars of color in linguistics. Part of this is structure, and I'll give you just one statistic. Out of the 100 accredited HBCUs in this country, there are none that confer an undergraduate degree in linguistics. There are also none that confer a PhD in linguistics. Now, we don't at UMBC either. We have our very wonderful language literacy and culture program. But the point is that in the discipline, the prestige degree is the linguistics PhD, or the linguistics BA, or the linguistics MA. And those are structurally limited to certain institutions a handful of elite, predominantly white institutions, all of which produces an insular linguistics. This past January, though, I was inducted as a fellow of the Linguistic Society of America, as you'll see here, which was a wonderful distinction to receive on a personal level, and also because it demonstrates a real shift over the past 20 years for the discipline in terms of recognizing the intellectual diversity of what can count as good science and who are being recognized as good scholars. When I started as a graduate student in 2000, the prevailing wisdom was that if you did sociolinguistics, as opposed to more formal linguistics, such as syntax, phonology, phonetics, your paper probably wouldn't even get accepted at the conference. As studies of the discipline have shown, the scholars who tend to be the most compelled to do sociolinguistics and other so-called applied fields that work with societal applications and impacts tend to be women and people of color. So you can see how these are, this is another way in which structural inequalities are embedded in the discipline. I want to go back for a minute to that paper that I just talked about on racial justice and linguistics that Ann and I and Mary wrote. We got serious pushback on that paper with people who were defensive and hostile. There were even senior scholars who emailed the editors of the journal to complain that our work was politicizing linguistics and asked that it not be published. Of course, they missed the point that linguistics and academia has always been political, as our founding feminist scholars and critical theorists have made clear for decades. Linguistics has its roots in empire and the colonizing practices of categorizing and classifying languages in order to control those who use them. And in the present day, the discipline has been limited by its own exclusionary practices and ideologies that have narrowed the field and made many would-be linguists feel unwelcome, shut out, pushed out, or relegated to the disciplinary margins. To respond to those points, and because we always do the most, Ann and I put together 2 huge edited collections, Decolonizing Linguistics and Inclusion in Linguistics. These volumes are hot off the press, published March 1st with Oxford University Press, and are completely open access thanks to many of our contributors' universities, including UBC. This project started in 2020, so it's been a long time coming, and we write about it in the prefaces of these volumes. We couldn't have done it without the wonderful multi-year support of our GA, Kara Seidel, so thank you, Kara. This has been our biggest effort thus far, and it's a broad and global-facing endeavor. There are 20 chapters per volume for a total of about 900 pages. In addition to the introductions and conclusions that we wrote for each volume, and in addition to those, one of the chapters in the Decolonizing volume is co-authored by about 10 members of our research network of Black scholars and allies in linguistics and language sciences that's funded through a second award from the National Science Foundation's Build and Broaden program. In each of the contributions across each volume, there's a focus on not just calling out longstanding inequalities in the field, but also on pushing for what linguistics can and should be by providing action steps and strategies for implementation and change. As we recently wrote in a blog post that accompanies these books on the OUP website, in these volumes we focus on envisioning and working to build a linguistics that is capacious and welcoming, particularly to those whose lived experiences give them fresh and much-needed insights into the kinds of questions linguistics should be asking, the kinds of methods it should be using, and the kinds of real-world impacts it should be making. Transformation demands that we ask ourselves who is and who isn't present in linguistics, whether they have full and equitable access, and whether the community of linguists will value their full humanity, rather than treating them merely as sources of linguistic data, or as token representations or spokespersons for the groups to which they belong. To put it simply, language is by everyone and for everyone, and the study of language should be the same. These volumes are giving us a global platform to keep pushing that conversation forward. It's my last slide here. Across all the work that I've shared with you today, the main issues of authenticity, equality, diversity, inclusion, these are themes that linguists have been grappling with for a long time and that are key to the humanities and the social sciences. In my last slide here, I want to put in a plug for team science, convergence, transdisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, and all of the other wonderful collaborative approaches to research that are out there that are helping produce research for the social good. Doing this type of work requires broad thinking, the bravery to step out of our comfort zones, and to learn each other's disciplinary languages, as well as patience, time, respect, communication. I firmly believe, just as this quote puts it so well, that teamwork is so powerful. As society continues to confront so many complex global issues, we can clearly see that no person, approach, or way of knowing can adequately address these issues single-handedly. From climate change to COVID to deepfakes, when we seek answers to fundamental societal challenges, we need to be bringing together people who think differently. I couldn't have done any of the work that I've done throughout my career that I've talked about today as thoroughly, as accurately, or as expansively, or with as much impact as if I had worked solo. And that's where I want to leave this talk with a big final thank you to all of you, my students, colleagues, collaborators, everyone who is in this room. Thank you all so much. Thank you all so much. I'd love to take some questions if anybody has any. Fun.
Thank you so much for this amazing talk, super inspiring. I'm hearing you are really at the cutting edge of these two forces that are converging. One is the rise of AI, and the other is the diversification of the linguistics field. But I was also struck by your mention of that one social linguist who is kind of co-opted to actually help AI develop better kinds of human voices. So how do you see yourself in that sort of conjunctural segment?
That's such a good question. Without giving away too much about this person and their training, I will say that in our Ph.D. programs, we should be encouraging our students to do research for social good and not, no offense to anyone with a startup, but I think there is this corporate academic pull, perhaps. One of the other issues that is such a difficult challenge is that, as we know, research is slower in many ways than innovation. And some of what we're uncovering is methodical, and we test it numerous times. And, whereas technology that you're developing can go as fast as you create it. And I think a lot of people are starting to either really get stressed about that and really want to tackle it, or kind of have this give up response, like, oh, well, there goes AI, that ship has sailed. Guess we can't do anything. There goes humanity. I mean, we can't afford, I think, to have that perspective, right? We cannot afford to have that perspective. And so I think education is huge, making sure that people understand, I think from a narrow linguistics point of view, the language that is going into AI and that is coming out of AI is not language in many ways. And I think we need to remember what's the humanity that is part of what makes us human, and also what is getting stripped away when that is being fed into a generator and then comes out of the generator and then gets fed back into the generator. There's some research out there on how the language that is being generated by large language models gets simpler over time because it's feeding back into itself. I mean, I had all this wonderful other research that I wasn't able to squeeze in today, so if anybody would like to see some of that, please let me know. But there is, some people are even saying this risk of global linguistic simplification in 150, 200 years. I don't know, I can't make those predictions, but I know that if we view that as language in the same way that we view what we're doing here as language, then that is a problematic direction. But thank you for that, Fawn. Jason.
Carl, did you want to go first?
Oh, I'm sorry, you were blocked by the screen.
MCS is down.
So, first of all, fabulous presentation. You touched on something. So my own work in my earlier life was very much in computer graphics and image simulations, right? And when you talked about the transition that how you can currently detect artificial intelligence generated fake speech, is a little bit where image simulation in the movies and in video games and all that was 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Everything was sharp, everything was clear, and then people figured out we need to put motion blur in there. and depth. Not everything is always sharp, right? When you look at it, and all those things that made the image imperfect made it much more real for us as humans. And I think that's the same thing that you're highlighting.
Yeah.
So yes, you help them to some extent to do their stuff better, but they already know that they have to go down this path, right? You add noise, you put background noise, you put all and in there. So there's a lot of similarities between what the movie industry and what the video game industry has done in the last 20 years as far as making it more and more realistic by making it a lot more unclean, for lack of a better term. And so I submit to you in 10 years, it's going to be impossible.
Yep.
Right? And it's more an observation, but really, I just want to commend you on the incredible work that you're doing.
Thank you, and it's a wonderful observation and one that I concur. There are other types of linguistic analyses out there that are also really interesting. They have the challenge of requiring sophisticated techniques and equipment. But they have the ability, I think, to be as precise as we might need to be in the future. One of those is that there's one study that's using fluid dynamics and techniques from physics to model whether a given sound clip could have even been produced by a human vocal tract. And one of the studies show that, well, the vocal tract to produce that speech would have had to be the width of a drinking straw. For another clip, it would have had to be the size of a giraffe. Now, to carry out those analyses, however, requires months of, training and so on, and often an audio sample for comparison. So I think the comprehensive approach is probably right? If we're just hanging our hat on this, I agree. It'll be as good as any technique we could use for image or anything else. But I think there's probably, I do still, think that there's a way for creativity and research to find new techniques, and maybe there are ways to automate some of those techniques of measurement. The other thing where I think linguists can contribute is the generation of watermarks. So there's an idea that maybe you don't even try to stop all this fake content, but you do try to put a stamp on it. This is fake, this is real. Something like, those little tickers that go across CNN, something like that, where if, you happen to be seeing something, it's like, this image is doctored or whatever. I don't know how you would do that for sound. So maybe we need all the sound studies folks in the room to help, but that might be an option. Jason.
I could talk about that, but I'm not going to, because you're exercising extraordinary discipline by only asking you one question. Thank you. It's such a great talk. So many wonderful ideas percolating in the room, I can tell. So what about when the innovators are not bad guys, but they're using maybe assistive speech for people with vocal disabilities who are trying, in fact, we met someone who from the University of Porto who was trying to help people to speak with to speak with their voice despite serious vocal cord injury, right? So it would be bad enough it was simply evil, mad scientists, but we also can imagine ways in which artificial speech is literally human speech, or the closest thing that some will have. So how do you think about that?
I promise that was not a planted question. I almost put some of that in the talk because Chloe, our one of our students on this project, we're working on an article that talks about a place for linguists and a place for sociolinguistics in this work. And one of the places is benevolent applications of the work. So if you have lost your ability to speak from, let's say, throat cancer, you had a total laryngectomy, you might want to be able to sound in a way that doesn't just sound like a robot, but that sounds somewhat close to how you normally would sound as yourself. Those technologies are out there. Other types of vocal restoration, but that's a really good example, folks with ALS and so on. So it's not that AI is all bad, absolutely. It's just how can we ensure that the good can flourish while we have guardrails on the bad, perhaps. But that is a great question. And I think linguists would be wonderfully applied to work on some of those issues. Susan.
Christine, thank you so much. This was awesome. So there are two particular populations that I was thinking about as you were giving your talk, and one of them are folks who are not in school, right? So I'm thinking about our parents' generation. And, my father would be totally mortified if he knew I was saying this, but my father, who's voice or whatever was crying, but my dad really thought it was my sister, who he has parented for all 45 years of her life, right?
Yeah.
So how do we get this kind of conversation and this kind of savviness or this training to people who aren't in classrooms?
Yes, excellent question. And again, I'm going to invoke Chloe here. One of our first meetings that Chloe joined, she said, you know, I really think this could be applied to my grandparents. We've got to get the word out to my grandparents. Do you remember when phone scams were starting, right? There was a lot of elder abuse that happened. I think that's exactly right. Vulnerable populations. I'm also thinking immigrant populations who may just be less facile, you know, with understanding English over the phone or something like that. I think that's a huge issue. Maybe the Wisdom Institute at UMBC would want to partner, or any of the, you know, organizations that maybe want to spread the word about the possibility of some of these scams and so on to the to elderly populations. One of the things I will say, if you scan the QR codes for the panels, you'll see the website that Vonda and I have put together, and we're making a fairly concerted push to do just as much public outreach as we are publication. So we've got, you know, a training video that we put together that's available online, the op-ed that we wrote, the test yourself on, you know, games and so on, the podcast episode. So we're doing, I think, some work to try to get that message out there, woefully underdeveloped given the need, right? So any students who are out there who might want to work on this, please let me know, because we have a lot of room for people who can take this further, I think. Carol.
I wanted to ask a question that ends up being kind of related, which is that perception itself also varies, right? There isn't just a human hearing, and we know there's a whole lot of age-related hearing loss, which has an effect on discernment. I wondered if you had worked with or considered working with audiologists and the hearing aid industry that are very interested in processing speech and the ways in which current assistive devices may or may not help people discern deep fakes or ways in which people who are managing hearing loss have different kinds of hearing discernment concerns, issues, abilities that might play in here for you know, grandparents' generation or
Yep.
father.
Yep, excellent point. I am going to point to Vonda back there because COEIT has a lot of research on human computer interaction and computer-assisted devices and so on. I think that's great. One of the original reviewers for our EAGER grant suggested that are people who are blind or low-sighted better at discerning? Maybe they're a little bit better at hearing some of these nuances. And, you know, there's probably a lot of areas for intersection of accessibility, disability, like you said, audiology, speech pathology, that I think are just totally wide open for exploration. So it's a great question. Vandana.
Amazing talk, as always. And I want to endlessly say that
Thank you.
Christine is a dream collaborator. So many thanks for that. But I have
Likewise.
a question for you, and to think broadly, that this type of research really happens when you bring disciplines together. It's hard. You're comfortable in your own disciplines. You want to work in your own nice piece of work and get it done. As you shared in your other work, it's very hard to break some of those barriers. How can we do more of these things? We just heard so many good questions that lots of people can look at. So based on your experience, how do we break through these silos and do more interdisciplinary research?
Again, I promise I did not plant that question. It is such a great question. And for that, I want to give out a shout out to the economics department. Enrico Burkus has a brand new paper about interdisciplinarity, and he happened to share it with me, and I thought, gosh, this is just so relevant and amazing. He tracked 150,000 scholars and looked at their careers and found that early career researchers who were trying to be interdisciplinary had challenges and barriers working against them, things like funding and so on, or things like, oh, well, you're probably not going to get tenure with an article in that journal, or, well, this is only for the linguistics program, this funding stream. He found that those challenges were so severe in many cases that it caused folks to drop out of academia. In contrast, if you stay longer in academia, there was a trend towards becoming more interdisciplinary again. So the point that they make in that paper, which hopefully will be out soon, maybe it is already, is that we should support our early career researchers to be interdisciplinary, and then also make sure that the folks in their later stages who are working together can mentor some of the junior folks to also continue that. Of course, structural efforts at universities to be interdisciplinary, like our committees and so on, to promote undergraduate student research are super important and helpful. But I think people may find this may be part of the drive towards industry. Maybe you can be more nimble there, and people don't care about boundaries and so on, or tenure in a particular discipline. So I think we do have some work to do in academia to make our scholarship as welcoming as it can be across the disciplines. I saw Nehal. Hi, Nehal. Nehal did our wonderful stats for this project.
I was wondering, what are you planning to do next in terms of your research? In which direction are you planning to move forward?
Great question. Well, we do have some things in the works that I'm not going to fully disclose just yet, but I will tell you that there is a huge infrastructure problem for the research on deepfakes. These data sets are scattered, they're not totally collected. Some of them say they're open access and they're not, they're outdated. Plus there's the linguistic issues that I talked about before where they're all in English. I recently read a paper about sign language and how there is ripe opportunity to manufacture signed speech, but where's the research on it? And again, this is just wide open. So I think one piece where we can contribute is trying to do a little bit of gathering to make sure that there's maybe repositories and so on where people can access some of this information, or even hold some researchers accountable who said, oh yeah, this stuff is gonna be open access, we'll put it on our GitHub or whatever. I'm not a GitHub person, but you get the point. And then they don't. Right? So we've got to make sure that if we're saying the stuff is available for other researchers to use, that it's available. And so I think that's a big piece, Nehal, that I know that several folks on the team have commented on before, just the difficulty of gaining access to some of this and the spottiness with which it's available. Yes, Lee.
Wonderful talk, really thought-provoking. I think from our perspective at the IRC, we just assume that everything will be, all the work that we're doing to discern deepfakes will simply be spun into, not just by humans, but by machines themselves, into making the deepfakes better. But in the spirit of interdisciplinarity, picking up on what you and Angela said, other disciplines have other ways of managing this, so in the arts, for example, you have prominence, right? Where did this come from? How can we prove where this came from? It's a big opportunity potentially, and context is big in the arts. And I think about literature. I keep thinking about this book, Stranger in a Strange Land. Wasn't that where the witness concept, I don't know if anybody else read it, but this idea that someone would have seen someone say it, and so the idea of triangulating, well, I guess that's four, so that would be triangulating, kind of overlaying different disciplines' approach to authenticity may offer some opportunity. What do you think about that?
Could not agree more, and I'm hoping that all of my wonderful, incredibly intelligent colleagues will have these ideas, and you might want to collaborate. I also think, Lee, to your point, this is something I've been thinking about a lot recently, is digital forensics and where that field goes. Because it used to be that you get somebody on the stand and they say, I saw you do X, Y, Z, right? Or I heard you do X, Y, Z, without the ability to prove it. How are we going to prove it? If these things get more and more, savvy, to many people's points here today, and if we don't have authentic audio samples for comparison, let's say, or if we don't have access to XYZ techniques, how are we going to prove that? Is that what we need to be doing? I mean, should we just have guardrails in place, legislative guardrails and so on? I don't know the answers to all of that, but I think those are going to be, if I would have to guess what would be some really important questions down the line, I would say that would be one. And I totally agree, we cannot do this work without, all of the disciplines in the room somehow, or at least contributing some ideas, right, for how to address it. You and then Craig. I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
Right?
So like, for a long time, we've had standardized, procedures, right, in accounting, whatever, for being able to trace back where financial details
Right.
and transactions, right, originally come from. We have auditors for that or whatever, right? Auditors and accountants for that, right? So I was just thinking whatever, right? It's like as technology becomes, more and more advanced or whatever, right? Even though, even though my discernment becomes more difficult, whatever, I imagine that it becomes more feasible in terms of engineering and resource or whatever, right? To be able to be able to, demand or whatever, right? That audio recording is at least used in like a business context or a legal context, right? Have tools in order to verify, right, where they originally come from, just like how the SEC, right, tries to make sure, right, that the financial records, right, of corporations can be verified.
Yep. Forensic accounting, right? To Lee's point about provenance, I mean, I think you all probably saw the Kate Middleton issue with the photo, right? I mean, we're still in a place where we're a little bit outraged in certain contexts that things are not real. I'm kind of interested in at what point, and I hope we don't get there, will people start to say, well, this is as real as anything. I don't know, to your point, how we implement something like forensic accounting, right, when it comes to sound. There is a field called forensic linguistics, and one of the things that it's done so far is if somebody, like the Unabomber, this is a real example, writes letters, you can kind of figure out maybe they came from this certain part of the US, and that might help you narrow down suspects and so on. I don't know if there are ways to adapt those techniques. I think the fact that it's sound as opposed to image means that it'll require different tools, and I'm hoping that linguistics can be part of that. But I think it's a really important point. Yeah. Craig.
Well, awe-inspiring, as everyone has said. I'm going to just begin by telling a story. In 2020, I got a text from Dean Moffat, and I went back and forth with the text, and then this Dean Moffat said to me, I'm in a meeting, send me gift cards.
Yep.
And I screamed out loud.
Yep.
And I screamed out loud and literally freaked out completely, thinking, this is a fake, I've been faked, I've been punked. And I think I might have even called Dean Moffat, and Dean Moffat calmed me down and said, this is going on a lot. People are imitating us. But here's my question about that. I'm interested in semantics and reading, as you know, and I'm interested in meaning. So it wasn't that the voice could have been perfect. It was that I knew the dean would never ask me for
Right.
money. And everyone here would understand.
Right. Context matters, yes, context. Right.
Context. And that's the way that I knew that I was being
Yep.
faked.
Yep.
It wasn't,
Yeah.
I'm a very gullible person, but it wasn't that the tone of voice or anything, it was the semantic context. So I'm wondering if
Yep.
that played an element in this research.
Well, I'm going to say this because it responds to Kimberly's really well taken and favorite point, and then maybe we'll break for the reception because I don't want to hold you all here too long, although thank you for your wonderful questions. I think what you're saying, Craig, is that in the future we might put even more of a premium on in-person interaction, because that's how you can tell if somebody's really telling you what they're trying to tell you. And I think that might be, we can have all sorts of fancy forensic accounting type techniques that maybe exist out there that we may or may not have access to, but we can usually find a way to interact with each other in person. The interesting thing about that Goldman Sachs call originally was that it was supposed to happen over Zoom. This was during the pandemic, and at the last minute they said, oh, well, our video's being wonky, let's just be camera off. And that helped the fraud potentially, take place, right? Because when we're piecing together, to your point about context, when we're seeing how people are moving and we're seeing how, the voice is modulated and we're seeing gesture and all of that, it's not foolproof, but it gives us more tools, right? And so I think there can be a premium on in-person interaction. Maybe we can have in-person conversation over our reception. That was good, right? Thank you all so much.